My Jewish journey is a bit of an unusual one. I grew up on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, which isn't that unusual. My parents had moved to America in 1965. They were raised Orthodox in the East End of London, and they came here on a boat with very little other than the promise from my father of a position at Columbia and the opportunity to finish his PhD. He was the first person in our family to go to college, and I was the second. So I grew up in the Upper West Side, immersed in a Jewish community, but really not involved in a Jewish community. The truth is, I was almost 30 years old before I'd ever heard of a Jewish federation. I grew up not learning to read Hebrew. I had a bar mitzvah, but my father taught me for it. On Sundays, we would travel around New York City going to Jewish historic sites, and that's how I studied and prepared for it. So I went off to college knowing that I was proud to be Jewish, really proud of it, but not very knowledgeable about what Judaism really meant. Probably I would say I was a Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney Jew. I had heard about Jews going to the South in the Civil Rights Movement, and that's what Judaism meant for me. So I did what made sense for me. First, I moved to Poland, where my grandparents had fled 60, 70 years earlier to go work for Solidarity when they took over the country, and had an experience as a very young person of having grown up in a neighborhood full of Jews, living where there were no Jews around, and being part of a social movement that toppled a government and changed a nation. I returned home and moved to South Carolina and got a job as a community organizer. Little known career at the time, and one that has been made quite famous in recent months. And while I was working as a community organizer in South Carolina, a few things happened that returned me to Judaism in a very stark way. First, one Sunday I was sitting in Reverend Kennedy's church in Lawrence County. It was a Baptist church. I was the only white face as far as you could see. And the minister looked at me. I worked with him on many projects. He looked at me. I was sitting in the front row, and he said, "Simon, we love your Exodus story." And I thought, oh no, I don't think I know my Exodus story. And it made me wonder, what is it about Judaism that has led me to be here in the rural South? Some months later, actually tragically, or nearly tragically, the Ku Klux Klan tried to blow up the church. And I was left wondering, they failed and we were all fine, but I was left wondering what led me out of these Jewish values to risk my life here in the rural South, like Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney a generation later. And it sent me on an inquiry to try to understand why was Judaism motivating me in such a profound way. And shortly thereafter, I was involved in a very interesting campaign, which I can tell you about some other time, to help a group of very low-wage bus drivers change their lives and seize the future for themselves and their families. And when I heard that we had won this very unexpected victory, the name Nachshon popped into my head. And I didn't know who Nachshon was, and I called home and said to my dad, "Tell me about Nachshon, because I keep thinking about him." And he said, "Well, that's the character we used to talk about at our Seder, that when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt and the Egyptian army was bearing down on them at the shores of the Red Sea, Moses stopped to pray, and Nachshon stepped out into the water until it was up to his nose, and only then did the Red Sea part." And our story about that was that the first act, or the most important, essential act of a free person, is risking their own lives for an unknown future, and that's when you get real results. That's when things start to change. So suddenly, I had a life-threatening experience, a call to know my Exodus story, and a flash in my head about a biblical character or a character out of the Jewish story that I didn't really understand. So this got me thinking. There's obviously something in Judaism for me, but I don't really understand it. And a couple of years later, I was on my own journey, my own inquiry. I was in Washington, D.C., and I went to my first text study. I didn't grow up knowing that Jews studied text, but I was lucky enough to stumble upon a text study with a terrific rabbi. And the text was the Hillel text, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm for myself alone, what am I? If not now, when? And I leaned over to the rabbi and I said, "Is this Jewish?" And he kind of laughed out loud and he said, "Well, of course it's Jewish. Why would you ask?" And I said, "Well, truthfully, this is the slogan we use at the organization I work for, an organization called Jobs with Justice." And he asked me, "Well, how do you think Jobs with Justice, a labor community coalition, would get a Hillel quote as their slogan?" And I thought for a minute, I thought, oh, well, probably because Larry Cohen, who founded Jobs with Justice, a nice Jewish boy from New Jersey, learned it growing up. It was part of his value system, and he came to express it at Jobs with Justice. And it was like it pulled back a curtain, and I started to see that across the social change landscape, there were Jews. People maybe a generation older than me or my contemporaries who were motivated by Jewish values, but they wouldn't talk about it in public. And I thought, there is an opportunity here for those people who are living Jewish values every day to own the Jewish values base and reclaim that they are leaders of a Jewish community that's now engaged in American life in a broader way. And if we could match those people up with the Jews involved in Jewish life who still desperately want to express their values, we could forge a Jewish community that lives its values every day in a very intense and meaningful way for themselves, for our community, and for America at large. And those things taken together really are the highlight moments in what's led me back into, I think, being centrally involved in the Jewish community and seeing Judaism as a pillar of who I am in a way that I never would have imagined 10 or 20 years ago.